Cleopatra relationship. Cleopatra and Caesar. What was their relationship? Fully prepared to seduce Caesar in order to enlist his help, Cleopatra planned to smuggle herself into Alexandria and inside the royal palace, where Caesar was staying as her brother's honored guest. Greek historian Plutarch, writing more than a century later, described how Cleopatra achieved her mission. Cleopatra embarked in a little skiff and landed at the palace when it was already getting dark. And as it was impossible to escape notice otherwise, she stretched herself at full length inside a bed sack, while Apollodorus, her servant, tied the bed sack up with a cord and carried it indoors to Caesar. Caesar, a man some 30 years her senior, seems to have been instantly captivated by the Egyptian queen, and after succumbing to the charm of further intercourse with her, he reconciled her to her brother on the basis of a joint share with him in the royal power. Cleopatra finally had the military support she needed to rule Egypt. Her brother husband was livid. On finding his banished sister and Caesar together at the palace, having clearly spent the night together, he reputedly flung his diadem to the ground and stormed out of the room, declaring his sister a traitor to Egypt. Chaos followed. Ptolemy besieged the palace in which Caesar was staying, and Cleopatra's younger sister Arsinoe also joined in the fight. She declared herself to be the true queen of Egypt and led rebel forces against her siblings. All must have seemed lost for Cleopatra and her Roman lover, but with the arrival of Caesar's troops from Syria, the tide turned once more. Ptolemy and Arsinoe were both defeated. Cleopatra's seat as Egyptian ruler now seemed secure. She was even pregnant with Caesar's child. But instead of declaring Cleopatra sole ruler of Egypt, the Roman general instead made her co-ruler with her remaining brother and soon-to-be husband, 12-year-old Ptolemy XIV. In June 47 BC, Cleopatra gave birth to a son, Ptolemy Caesar, known as Caesarion Little Caesar, although the child was never formally acknowledged by his father. The pair followed Caesar to Rome, where they were officially welcomed as friends and allies of the Roman people. Beneath the veneer of its friendly exterior, Rome was furious. Caesar had no sons from his Roman wife, Calpurnia, and none from his previous wives. The idea of Caesarion, the son of a foreigner from a land despised as a pleasure-loving and decadent society growing up to claim rule over a civilized Rome as Caesar's heir, was intolerable. That situation never came to pass, however, as the Caesar named his grandnephew Octavian, who would later take the name Augustus, as his heir. When, in 44 BC, Caesar was assassinated, Cleopatra, a much disliked figure in Rome, whose gold-covered statue stood in the city's temple of Venus Genitrix, fled with her son. Just months later, the Egyptian queen's second brother-husband was also dead, likely on her orders, and Cleopatra was free to rule with her 3-year-old son and plan the infant succession as emperor of Rome. Back in Rome, however, trouble was brewing. Disputes had broken out over who would succeed Caesar, with both Octavian and the Roman general Mark Antony seeking power. By 41 BC, the leadership had been split. Antony was governing the eastern region and Octavian the west. Following Cleopatra's return, Rome had left Egypt in relative peace, but the Senate's eyes turned once more to the wealthy empire, when Antony decided he needed money to subdue his enemies in the Parthian Empire, now Iraq. Mark Antony and Cleopatra. Conveniently, Cleopatra had befriended Mark Antony during her time in Rome and supported him militarily during the ensuing civil war. She now agreed to meet him in Tarsus, modern-day Turkey, to discuss the prospect of Egyptian support in a war against the Parthians. In an echo of plans made 7 years earlier with her former lover, Cleopatra set out for Tarsus to charm and seduce her unsuspecting old friend. This time, however, her entrance was somewhat grander. In Plutarch's words, Cleopatra came sailing up the river Cydnus in a barge with gilded stern and outspread sails of purple, while oars of silver beat time to the music of flutes and fifes and harps. She herself lay all along under a canopy of cloth of gold, dressed as Venus in a picture, and beautiful young boys like painted cupids stood on each side to fan her. Like Caesar before him, Antony was captivated. The attraction of her person, joining with the charm of her conversation, and the character that attended all she said or did, was something bewitching, Plutarch tells us. It was a pleasure merely to hear the sound of her voice. Indeed, Antony was so taken with the pharaoh that he abandoned his original reasons for meeting at Tarsus. He left his wife to manage his affairs in Rome, and his troops waiting for orders, while he spent the winter of 40 BC in Alexandria with Cleopatra. They were inseparable. During his stay, Cleopatra gained Antony's support in ridding her of the one person who had the power to disrupt her absolute rule in Egypt, Arsinoe. Defeated in battle, Arsinoe had been banished to the Temple of Artemis in Roman-controlled Ephesus in modern-day Turkey. In 41 BC, on Antony's orders, and in scandalous violation of the sanctuary she'd been promised, Arsinoe was murdered on the temple steps. The following year, Cleopatra gave birth to twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene II. Antony, however, had finally been forced to return to Rome to deal with the aftermath of his failed rebellion against Octavian. A political alliance known as the Second Triumvirate was formed between the two generals and a dignitary named Marcus Aemilius Lepidus. Recently widowed, Antony agreed to seal the peace deal with a marriage to Octavian's sister, Octavia Minor, in 40 BC. But Cleopatra was never far from Antony's mind, and in 37 BC, he returned to Alexandria, where he fathered another son, Ptolemy Philadelphus, and Cleopatra and Caesarion were crowned co-rulers of Egypt and Cyprus. For a happy ending, the story should end there, but it doesn't. Ever greedy for power, Octavian continued to campaign for sole power in Rome, successfully eliminating Lepidus from the triumvirate. In 33 BC, allegedly in retaliation for Antony divorcing his sister, Octavian did the unthinkable. He declared war on the Egyptian queen. 2 years later, in 31 BC, the combined armies of Antony and Cleopatra took on Octavian's forces in a great sea battle at Actium, off Greece's west coast. The battle was a disaster for the lovers. Victorious, Octavian invaded Egypt, where he received the surrender of the defeated Roman forces. Antony's efforts to become sole ruler of the Roman world had ended, and, first believing that his amour had forged an agreement with Octavian to ensure her own survival, and then that she had committed suicide, he attempted to fall on his sword in true Roman tradition. But even in this he failed, and his wounded body was taken to Cleopatra, who, still very much alive, was hiding in a mausoleum. There, Antony succumbed to his wounds, reportedly dying in his lover's arms. Cleopatra realized that without her lover and his troops, she and her beloved country were now at the mercy of the triumphant Octavian. Knowing she would be paraded around as his prisoner should she be captured, the proud Egyptian queen chose to take her own life, reputedly by allowing a poisonous Egyptian cobra or aspis to bite her. Rome had emerged victorious. The age of the Pharaohs was dead.